All right. Hey, everyone. If you're a UPSC aspirant, and especially if international relations is your thing, well, this deep dive is for you.
Yeah, we're going to be diving into Aristotle.
Aristotle,
Yeah.
the guy.
Yeah.
And you might think, wait, Aristotle? That's like ancient history. How's that going to help me with IR today?
Yeah, it's going to be good. Trust me. Stick around because his ideas on ethics and politics and happiness, they're way more relevant than you might think, especially for understanding how the world works, on the big international stage.
So just to be clear, we're looking at some excerpts, a text that really focuses on Aristotle's views on happiness.
Right.
But before you think, oh, this is a self-help episode. No, no, no. Aristotle wasn't talking about, like fluffy, feel-good happiness.
Yeah.
He was talking about eudaimonia. It's this idea of living a really fulfilling life, a life of excellence. And and that's where the connection to IR starts to get really interesting. Because when you think about it, nations, just like people, they're always trying to, like, reach their full potential, right?
Absolutely. It's like they're each striving for their own version of eudaimonia on the world stage.
Okay, so what would that even look like for a whole country, trying to reach this eudaimonia? Is it about having the strongest military? Is it all about the money? Or maybe it's their culture?
It's probably a mix of all those things, right? It's definitely complicated. There's no easy answer. But the cool thing is, Aristotle gives us a framework, a way to actually think about it.
Okay.
He saw happiness or eudaimonia as being tied to action, like actively pursuing virtue and excellence.
So it's not enough for a country to just, like, exist.
Very.
They have to actively be working towards something bigger, something better, reaching for those goals, trying to fulfill their potential in the world.
Exactly. And the whole idea of active striving, that's key. It forces us to think about what those goals should be, how a country should pursue them, and, where ethics and virtue fit into all of that.
Okay, so speaking of ethics and virtue, Aristotle had a lot to say about the human soul. Might seem kind of random, but stick with me here. He divided the soul into three parts: vegetative, appetitive, and rational. So for our UPSC deep dive, what do you think is the most important part when we're trying to understand international relations?
Well, all three parts matter, obviously.
Sure. Yeah.
The vegetative part, that's like the basic stuff, survival. The appetitive part, that's all about our desires, our emotions. But when it comes to IR, it's that rational part that really sets the stage.
Okay, so the rational part. Explain that to me. How does that fit in?
Well, think about it. It's the part that helps us as humans make strategic decisions, the ones with long-term consequences. It allows us to be diplomatic, negotiate, all that complex stuff.
Right, right. So it's not just about acting on impulse or, going for the quick win. It's about thinking ahead, considering all the angles.
Exactly. The rational part helps us move beyond those short-term desires and really grapple with the bigger picture.
This is super crucial when you think about world leaders making decisions that affect, like, millions of people. Imagine if they were only driven by emotions or, just wanted to look good in the moment. Things could get messy fast.
Oh, yeah. Disastrous, even, for their own country and probably the whole world.
And that's why, if you're studying IR, especially for the UPSC, getting a grasp on human nature, and that rational side in particular, is so, so important.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay. So we've got nations, like people, striving for eudaimonia. We know that reason, that rational part, plays a huge role in making smart decisions. But how do we actually achieve this excellence? Like, what's the path?
Well, Aristotle believed it all boiled down to virtues.
Okay, virtues. We hear that word a lot. What did he mean exactly?
He meant two types: intellectual virtues and ethical virtues.
Got it. So intellectual virtues, those are all about knowledge, right? Wisdom.
Exactly. And he had a very specific kind of wisdom in mind. He called it practical wisdom, basically being able to make good judgments in real-life situations.
Ah, so it's not enough to just be book smart. You got to know how to actually use that knowledge, make it work for you in the real world.
Right. And that's a quality we definitely want in our diplomats and policymakers.
Absolutely. But then we've got the ethical virtues.
Yeah, those are just as important for a well-lived life. Things like courage, justice, generosity. And for anyone dealing with the really complex moral landscape of international relations, well, they're absolutely vital.
Okay, so it's like a two-part. You got to have the knowledge and the skills, but then you also need to have the right character, that moral compass to, like, guide you.
Exactly. And Aristotle believed that virtue isn't something you're just born with, It's something you have to develop through practice and habit.
It's like training for a marathon. You don't just wake up one day and run 26 miles. You have to train, build up your endurance, and, develop that runner's mindset.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And in the same way, you can train yourself to be more virtuous.
Interesting. So we can actually work on becoming better people, developing those qualities that will help us lead more fulfilling lives and make the world a better place.
That's the idea.
Now, before we go any further, I got to ask, which kind of virtue do you think is more important for a world leader? Like, is it more important to be brilliant, or is it more important to have a strong moral compass? Could a leader be successful with just one, or do they really need both?
Ooh, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, history's full of really smart leaders who made terrible choices, ethically.
Yeah.
And then you have those leaders who, maybe weren't the sharpest tools in the shed, but they had this incredible moral integrity that guided them to do the right thing.
Right.
So maybe it's not a question of either, maybe you need a bit of both.
It's all about balance. Which brings us to one of Aristotle's most famous ideas, the golden mean.
Exactly. The idea that virtue is often about finding that middle ground, avoiding those extremes.
So like courage, right, if you have too little, you're a coward. Too much, you're reckless. The ideal, according to Aristotle, is somewhere in the middle, finding that sweet spot.
That virtuous courage. And he didn't just apply this concept to individual character, he used it in politics too. He believed that the most stable societies, the most just societies, were the ones with what he called mixed constitutions, a blend of different forms of government.
Interesting. A blend, so they kind of balance each other out. Okay, but how does this idea of the golden mean actually work in like the real world of international relations? I mean, can you really find a middle ground when you're dealing with things like war or poverty or climate change?
That's where things get really tough, That's
Yeah.
what you UPSC folks should really think about.
Absolutely.
Because finding that balance, that middle ground, it's often the key to good diplomacy, to making policies that actually work.
Okay, so we've got this idea of the golden mean, this quest for balance. But even Aristotle knew that sometimes you need a little luck. He called these things external goods. Things like good health, wealth, and friends. And he seemed to place a lot of emphasis on friends.
He did. Friendship was a big deal to him, essential for a good life, he said, and even a foundation for a just society.
But how does friendship, something so personal, how does that fit into the world of international relations? I mean, can countries really be friends in the same way that people can?
Well, that's a question that's been debated for centuries, and it's something we'll definitely dive into deeper as we go. But remember, Aristotle saw friendship as more than just, knowing someone.
Right, it's deeper than that.
Yeah, much deeper. It was about mutual respect, admiration, and having shared values.
And maybe, just maybe, those are the ingredients that can lead to better relationships between nations. Stronger relationships, more peaceful relationships.
It's definitely something to think about, especially given the state of the world today, all the challenges, but also all the opportunities.
Okay, so we've talked about striving for excellence. We've talked about the importance of reason and virtue, finding that golden mean, and even the role of friendship. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that Aristotle really emphasized: education.
Oh, yeah. Education. He was big on that.
He had this very specific vision of the ideal man, someone who was self-sufficient, composed, thoughtful, not easily swayed by their emotions or by outside pressure.
And that's where education comes in. Aristotle saw it as the key to shaping people into good citizens, citizens who could actually contribute to their state, make things better. It wasn't just about stuffing their heads with facts, it was about shaping their character.
So it's not just about personal growth, it's about preparing citizens to be active participants in their community.
Exactly, to really understand and engage in the political life of their society.
And for our UPSC folks, this raises some really interesting questions. How does this ideal man that Aristotle talked about, how does that compare to our ideas about leadership today? And how do different education systems around the world, how do they reflect the political philosophies of their own countries?
Those are great questions, and we'll definitely be exploring those in more depth as we continue our exploration of Aristotle and, what his ideas mean for international relations today.
This is just the beginning of our deep dive into Aristotle and how his ideas can actually help us understand this complex world of international relations.
It's amazing how Aristotle tied education to the state's values. He really thought that education should match the goals and the whole structure of whoever's in charge.
So it's not just about, personal growth, but about shaping citizens who will actually, uphold their society's ideals.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder how different education systems, around the world, how they reflect their country's political philosophies and how that, in turn, might actually influence how they approach, like, global relations.
Precisely, think about it. If a country's education system really stresses cooperation, diplomacy, it'll probably have a different foreign policy than one that's all about, military strengths and competition.
That's a really good point, especially if you're prepping for the UPSC.
Hmm.
Understanding a nation's educational philosophy could be like a secret weapon. It gives you this extra layer of insight into why countries do what they do, what their motivations might be, and what they might do next.
Absolutely. It adds a whole new dimension when you're analyzing international relations. Now let's switch gears for a sec.
Yeah.
Go back to Aristotle's concept of happiness. Remember he said external goods like wealth and health, those can help us live a good life. But he was also really big on friends.
Yeah, and I remember you said that Aristotle believed real friendship goes way beyond just knowing someone. It's about like a true connection, having shared values, and being willing to support each other's growth. But I'm still kind of stuck on how this friendship thing works in international relations, which can be pretty cutthroat, let's be honest.
Well, keep in mind, Aristotle even said that friendship could actually make justice less necessary.
He did say that, didn't he?
Yeah.
His argument was that if people are really connected, if they genuinely care for one another, well, you need fewer laws and punishments because everyone's just naturally trying to do right by each other. It's a beautiful thought, but can we really apply that to entire nations?
It's definitely a tough concept to wrap your head around, but think about the European Union, for example. Isn't there a sense of shared identity, of working together among those countries that goes beyond just politics or economics?
That's a good one. And then there are groups like the United Nations, which, even with their flaws, they're trying to encourage dialogue and peaceful solutions to conflicts.
Exactly. They're not perfect, but they do suggest that maybe Aristotle's vision, this idea of friendship playing a big role in international relations, maybe it's not just a pipe dream.
It's a fascinating thought experiment. How would fostering true friendship between nations, based on respect and understanding, how would that change the world? Could it lead to a more stable and peaceful world order? And it ties back to what we were talking about earlier, the importance of reason in international relations.
Right. Aristotle was convinced that humans, unlike other animals, have this capacity for reason, and that this ability should be guiding our actions on the world stage. It's what helps us see beyond our own immediate needs and consider how our actions affect others.
And that brings us right back to the idea of virtue. Remember Aristotle's argument that virtue, both intellectual and ethical, is essential for a good life.
He was adamant about that. He truly believed it's not enough to just be smart or know the right thing to do. We also need to have the character, the moral strength to actually act virtuously.
So it's not just about having good ideas, it's about having the courage and the integrity to make those ideas a reality. And that's got to be super crucial in international relations where the stakes are so high.
You got it. And this doesn't just apply to, individuals like diplomats and leaders, but to whole nations. How a country acts on the world stage, its commitment to justice, human rights, its willingness to cooperate and help others, all of that speaks volumes about its character.
It's like that idea of soft power, right?
Yeah.
A nation's ability to influence others, not through force, but through its values and actions.
You nailed it. Aristotle would probably say that a nation that demonstrates virtue through its actions and policies is way more likely to gain the respect and cooperation of other nations.
And that kind of respect, that cooperation, could be incredibly valuable in the world of international relations. Maybe even more effective than military power in the long run.
You could be right. It's all about building trust, forming partnerships, working together to tackle those shared challenges. Those are essential skills for anyone who wants to work in diplomacy or international relations, especially for those taking the UPSC exam.
Speaking of the UPSC, Aristotle had some pretty strong views on how societies should be organized to promote stability and justice. Remember his idea of mixed constitutions?
Oh, yeah. He thought the most stable and just societies were the ones that found that balance between different forms of government, to stop any one group from becoming too powerful.
It's like he predicted the concept of checks and balances, which we see in a lot of democracies today. But does this mixed constitution thing make sense in international relations? Can we even talk about a global constitution?
That's a good question. There's definitely no single world government, with the same kind of authority as a national government. But we can see elements of mixed constitutions at work in the international system.
I'm all ears. Give me an example.
Well, think about the players on the world stage. You have nation states, obviously, but then you also have international organizations like the UN, regional groups like the EU, big corporations, even non-governmental organizations. They all have their own agendas, their own types of power.
So it's kind of like different branches of government, each with its own role and responsibilities.
Exactly. And the way they all interact, it creates a kind of balance,
Mhm.
keeps any one entity from getting too much power. It's messy, no doubt, but it's also dynamic. And in a way, it kind of reflects what Aristotle was talking about, the need for balance, for checks on power.
And for our UPSC folks, this understanding of who the players are and how they interact, it's crucial for analyzing international relations and creating effective foreign policy. It's not just about memorizing history and theories, it's about understanding the power dynamics and motivations of those key players.
Absolutely. And speaking of power dynamics, let's bring back one of Aristotle's most famous ideas, the golden mean.
Ah, yes. The art of finding that sweet spot, avoiding those extremes. And like you said earlier, it's not just about individual character, it's about finding balance in every aspect of life. That includes politics and international relations.
Right, remember Aristotle's example of courage. Too little, and you're a coward. Too much, you're reckless. Finding that middle ground, that's where the virtue lies.
Well, how do you apply that to something as complex as, let's say, a country's military strategy?
Well, think about how much a country spends on its military. On one hand, you could totally ignore defense, leaving yourself wide open to attack. That might appeal to people who put their own national interests above everything else.
Right, the look out for number one approach. But what would the opposite look like?
Well, you could go all in on the military, throw all your resources at it, but then you end up neglecting other important stuff like education and healthcare.
So neither extreme is good. So where's that golden mean in this case?
It's about finding a more balanced approach. Having a military that's strong enough to discourage attacks, but not so overpowering that it hurts the well-being of your own citizens.
It's about using your resources wisely, recognizing that true strength comes from considering all aspects of national well-being, not just military power.
Exactly. And this principle of balance can be applied to so many other areas of international relations.
Like trade agreements,
Mm.
environmental policies, diplomatic negotiations. It sounds like the golden mean could be like a guiding principle for our future diplomats as they deal with the complexities of the world.
It's definitely a valuable tool. It reminds us that the best solutions usually come from finding that middle ground, that point where different interests and values can all exist together.
It's about compromising, building consensus, and recognizing that working together is often more effective than fighting.
Wise words from Aristotle that are just as relevant today as they were centuries ago.
Absolutely. And it all comes back to the idea of external goods and their role in helping us flourish. We were talking about how much Aristotle valued friendship, but he also mentioned things like wealth and health. It's like he was saying that you need a certain amount of good fortune, along with virtue, to really thrive.
And that goes for nations, too. A nation needs a certain level of economic prosperity, access to resources, and a healthy population to reach its full potential.
But it's not all about money, right? Aristotle also emphasized the importance of having social and political structures that are fair and just. He believed that those external goods were necessary, but not enough for true happiness.
Exactly. They're like the foundation, but it's virtue, the pursuit of excellence in all areas of life that allows both individuals and nations to truly flourish.
It sounds like Aristotle was trying to strike a balance between individual responsibility and the role society plays in helping people live well. And that's a theme that runs through all his work, from his ethics to his politics to his ideas about international relations.
It's that big picture thinking, that understanding that everything's connected, that makes Aristotle so relevant to studying international relations, even today.
And for our UPSC folks, it's a reminder that the exam isn't just about cramming facts and figures. It's about developing a deep understanding of what shapes our world and the ability to apply those principles to real-life situations.
It's about thinking critically, breaking down complex problems, and finding creative solutions. And Aristotle's work is a great framework for developing those skills.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about striving for excellence, the role of reason and virtue, the golden mean, the role of friendship and external goods, and even how a nation's values are reflected in its education system. But there's one more aspect of Aristotle's philosophy that I think is especially important for our deep dive into international relations. His idea of the ideal man.
Right, Aristotle described this person as self-sufficient, composed, thoughtful, someone who's not easily swayed by their emotions or outside pressures. And even though Aristotle was mainly talking about individual character, It's interesting to think about how those qualities might apply to nations on the world stage.
So what would a nation that embodies those Aristotelian ideals look like? Would it be self-reliant, making decisions based on careful thought rather than quick reactions? Would it be a nation that's not easily manipulated by others?
Those are all key aspects of the Aristotelian ideal, and it's fascinating to think about which countries, if any, actually come close to embodying those qualities in their foreign policy.
That's a great question. And it leads us to another crucial part of Aristotle's thinking, the role of education in shaping individuals and societies.
Absolutely. For Aristotle, education wasn't just about gaining knowledge and skills. It was about cultivating virtue, encouraging a love of learning, and preparing people to actively participate in their community.
And remember, he stressed that education should align with the values and goals of the state. So if we want to see nations embodying those Aristotelian ideals in their interactions with the world, maybe we need to start by looking at our own education systems.
That's a powerful point, and it's something our UPSC aspirants should really think about. After all, they're the future diplomats and policymakers, the ones who'll be dealing with all the complexities of international relations.
Exactly. Understanding these fundamental principles will be critical in shaping the world they're going to inherit.
Couldn't agree more. And that's a good place to pause for now. Join us in part 3 as we wrap up our exploration of Aristotle and how his ideas can help us make sense of the world today.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Aristotle. It's amazing how relevant his ideas still are, especially when we're talking about international relations.
Yeah, we've seen how his emphasis on reason, balance, striving for excellence, those are all super valuable insights for understanding how countries interact on that global stage.
We've talked about nations pursuing their own version of eudaimonia, the role of virtues, and even how something like friendship could actually play a part in international relations. And of course, we can't forget about the golden mean.
Right, that idea of finding the middle ground, avoiding the extremes.
Which actually brings me to a question. We've talked about how the golden mean applies to individual character and even to domestic politics. But how does it work in a nation's foreign policy? Finding that balance seems like it would be really tough in the world of international relations with all the high stakes and everything.
It definitely is. It's one of the biggest challenges, but that's exactly why it's such an important concept, especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC. Because in real life, diplomats and policymakers are always facing these situations where they have to weigh different interests, find solutions that don't go too far in any one direction.
Okay, so how about a real-world example? How would a country actually apply the golden mean to an international issue?
Let's take foreign aid, for instance. On one extreme, you could have a country that refuses to give any aid at all, leaving other countries to struggle on their own.
Right, a very every nation for itself kind of approach. But what would the other extreme look like?
The other extreme would be giving aid with no strings attached, without thinking about the consequences. That could lead to dependency, corruption. It could even make things worse.
So both extremes have problems. Where's the golden mean in all of this?
It's about finding a smarter approach. Providing aid strategically, focusing on sustainable solutions, making sure the aid gets to the people who really need it, and being aware of the potential downsides.
So it's about balancing compassion with responsibility, looking out for your own interests, while also thinking about the bigger picture, global well-being.
Exactly. And this principle of the golden mean, you can use it for all sorts of issues in international relations. Think about trade deals. One extreme is shutting everything down, refusing to trade with anyone. The other extreme is completely open trade, no restrictions, which can lead to problems like job losses.
So the golden mean would be finding a trade policy that encourages economic growth, but also protects industries and workers at home.
Exactly, finding that balance. And you can apply it to environmental policies, diplomacy, even military actions.
So it's not just an abstract idea. The golden mean is a practical tool that can help us navigate the complexities of international relations.
That's right. It's a valuable tool and
Yeah.
definitely something to keep in mind if you're thinking about a career in this field, especially if you're taking the UPSC.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and revisit one of Aristotle's more challenging concepts,
Yeah.
the ideal man. Remember, he described this individual as self-sufficient, composed, thoughtful, not easily swayed by emotions or outside pressure.
Yeah, and while he was focusing on individual character, I think it's interesting to consider what those qualities would look like on a national level in terms of how a country behaves on the world stage.
So imagine a nation that actually embodies these Aristotelian ideals. What would that look like? A country that's self-reliant, that makes decisions based on reason and careful thought, that isn't easily manipulated by others.
That's the Aristotelian ideal right there. And it's a great thought experiment to consider which countries, if any, come close to that in their foreign policy.
Definitely. Which brings us to another key aspect of Aristotle's philosophy, education.
Education was huge for Aristotle. He believed it wasn't just about gaining knowledge, it was about developing virtue, nurturing a love of learning, and preparing citizens to participate in their community.
And remember, he stressed how important it was for education to align with the values and goals of the state. So if we want to see nations acting on those Aristotelian ideals, maybe we need to take a good look at our own education systems.
Absolutely. Are we teaching people to think critically, to be reasoned, and make good judgments? Are we instilling in them a sense of responsibility, a commitment to the greater good?
Those are questions every nation should be asking. Because in the end, a nation's character is a reflection of its people.
Very true. And that's why Aristotle's ideas are so relevant for anyone interested in international relations, especially those preparing for the UPSC. Understanding human behavior, political dynamics, those are essential for navigating the complexities of the world.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Aristotle, I want to leave you with one final question to think about. Imagine Aristotle was advising a modern nation. What would be his top 3 recommendations for navigating the world stage?
That's a great one. I think he would definitely start by emphasizing the importance of virtue for both leaders and citizens. He'd remind us that reason, balance, that pursuit of excellence, those are crucial for tackling the challenges of international relations.
And I think he would encourage us to work towards a world where cooperation and mutual respect are the norm, rather than conflict and self-interest. A world where nations, just like individuals, can reach their full potential and contribute to the well-being of all.
Wise words indeed. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those recommendations. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the ideas that shape our world. And best of luck to all our UPSC aspirants out there.